In the brutal, wind-swept plains of North Dakota, a curse lay hidden beneath the soil. While generations of farmers broke their backs, hauling away useless stones, one desperate man stopped digging and started stacking. What his neighbors called a monument to madness soon became a secret that shattered every farming record. The Oakhaven Valley of North Dakota was a place where dreams of golden harvests usually turned into choking dust. It wasn't just the bitter cold or the scorching summers that broke the men who tried to tame it. It was the wind. Locals called it the Devil's Breath, a relentless, howling gale that swept down from the Canadian border, stripping away precious topsoil and leaving the earth raw and bleeding. For Thomas Garrick, a 34-year-old first-generation farmer, Oakhaven was supposed to be a fresh start. He and his wife Sarah had sunk their life savings, along with a staggering $400,000 loan from the First Dakota Bank, into 300 acres of foreclosed land on the valley's western edge. The property was cheap, and Thomas soon learned why. It wasn't just the wind. It was the rocks, glacial till the geologists called it. Every winter the deep freeze would grip the soil, and every spring thaw would heave up a fresh, jagged crop of granite and limestone. For a century, the unwritten law of Oakhaven farming was simple. You spent the first 3 weeks of April breaking your back, tossing those stones into a wagon, and dumping them into the deep ravine at the edge of the county line. If you didn't, your plow blades would shatter, and your tractor would tear itself apart. Thomas's neighbor Harlan Miller owned 2,000 acres of prime bottomland. Harlan was a third-generation titan of the valley, a man who navigated his fields in an air-conditioned, $500,000 John Deere combine. He viewed Thomas not as a peer, but as a temporary nuisance. "You bought a graveyard, Garrick." Harlan sneered one morning at the local diner, swirling his black coffee. "That land chewed up the Miller family in the 20s. It bankrupted the O'Connors in the 80s, and it's going to spit you out before Christmas. The wind takes the soil and the rocks take your machinery. You're fighting a war the earth already won." Thomas didn't answer. He just looked down at his hands, heavily calloused, and wrapped in white medical tape to cover the bleeding blisters. Harlan wasn't wrong. For 2 agonizing years, Thomas had fought the earth. He had planted corn only to watch the Devil's Breath snap the young, fragile stalks in late June. He had planted winter wheat only to see the topsoil blown away, leaving the seeds exposed to rot in the sun. By the spring of 1998, the Garrick farm was standing on the precipice of total ruin. The bank was circling. Richard Cole, the senior loan officer at First Dakota, had driven out to the farm the previous Tuesday in his spotless silver sedan. Cole didn't even bother to step onto the dirt, preferring to roll down his window to deliver the ultimatum. "Thomas, I'm looking at the projections," Cole had said, his voice clipped and devoid of empathy. "You're 2 payments behind. The bank is willing to roll the debt into the fall, but only if you hit a yield of 150 bushels an acre. If you don't bring in a bumper crop this harvest, we are foreclosing in November. I'm sorry, but numbers don't lie. 150 bushels, on land that had barely yielded 80 the year before. It was a death sentence. That evening, a defeated Thomas walked out into his westernmost field. The wind was already picking up, biting at his face, and whipping dust into his eyes. In the middle of the barren, freshly tilled dirt sat a massive pile of rocks he had spent the last 12 hours digging out. He was supposed to load them into the rusted Ford flatbed and drive them to the ravine, just like every other farmer did. Exhausted, his muscles screaming in agony, Thomas collapsed against the pile of stones. He buried his face in his hands, the reality of losing his home, of failing Sarah crashing down on him. But as he sat there in the fading twilight, something strange caught his attention. The wind was screaming across the open plains, violently shaking the few weeds that clung to the earth. Yet right where Thomas was sitting, tucked behind the jagged 5-foot-high pile of discarded granite, the air was completely still. He lit a match. The flame barely flickered. He looked closer at the dirt directly behind the stones. While the rest of the field was dry and cracked, the soil here was darker, holding on to the morning's moisture. And pushing up through that dark earth was a dense, vibrant patch of wild clover. It was completely sheltered from the devastating shear of the wind. Curious, Thomas placed his bare hand against the largest stone in the pile. He recoiled slightly. It was warm. The sun had been baking the granite all day, and now, even as the evening air dropped into the low 40s, the rocks were radiating a gentle, sustained heat into the surrounding soil. Thomas stood up, his heart suddenly hammering against his ribs. He looked at the endless miles of flat, unprotected land, completely vulnerable to the merciless winds. Then he looked at the thousands of rocks protruding from the earth, the very rocks that had broken the spirits of every man who had worked this land before him. They weren't a curse. They were the cure. Generations of farmers had been bleeding themselves dry to throw away the only armor the land had. They had stripped the earth naked and wondered why it froze and blew away. Thomas didn't load the flatbed that night. Instead, he walked back to the farmhouse, his eyes burning with a wild, desperate light. He pulled out a piece of grid paper and began to draw. He wasn't going to throw the rocks into the ravine anymore. He was going to build a wall. The following Monday, the town of Oakhaven realized Thomas Garrick had completely lost his mind. Instead of prepping his seed drills or applying the expensive liquid fertilizers he couldn't afford, Thomas was out on the western edge of his property line, driving a skid-steer loader back and forth. But he wasn't clearing the rocks away. He was hauling them up the ridge. Word spread quickly. Harlan Miller parked his truck on the county highway, binoculars pressed to his eyes, laughing so hard he spilled his thermos of coffee. "He's building a damn castle," Harlan told the crowd at the diner later that afternoon. "The banker's breathing down his neck. Planting season is 3 weeks away, and Garrick is out there playing with stones like a giant toddler. He snapped. The wind finally drove him crazy." It certainly looked like madness. Thomas had mapped out a massive crescent-shaped line stretching nearly a mile along the western boundary of his property, directly facing the prevailing winds. He was constructing a dry stone wall, no mortar, no cement, just sheer gravity geometry and back-breaking labor. It was a technique as old as the Scottish Highlands, but entirely alien to modern American agribusiness. Thomas laid the massive, flat limestone boulders at the base, interlocking them with smaller granite stones. He built the wall 4 feet thick at the bottom, tapering it up to a height of 6 feet. But he didn't build it solid. He deliberately left small, strategic gaps between the stones. A solid wall would force the howling wind up and over, creating a violent vacuum on the other side that would rip the crops out of the ground anyway. By leaving tiny gaps, the wall would act as a baffle, slowing the wind down, breaking its brutal force into a gentle breeze, while the sheer height would force the bulk of the gale upward. The physical toll was catastrophic. Sarah watched from the kitchen window, her heart aching, as she saw her husband lifting 100-pound stones in the freezing rain. By the end of the first week, Thomas had blown out a tire on the skid steer and had to resort to a crowbar and his bare hands. He tore the ligaments in his left shoulder. He crushed 2 fingers on his right hand when a limestone slab slipped, turning his fingernails black. "Thomas, please," Sarah begged him one night, wrapping his swollen, bruised hands in ice packs. Richard Cole called again today. He wanted to know why we haven't bought our seed corn yet. "The neighbors are talking. They think you've had a breakdown. We need to plant." "If we plant now, the wind will take it." "Sarah." Thomas whispered, his voice hoarse from breathing limestone dust. "It takes it every year. We have to finish the barrier." He worked under the glaring halogen floodlights of his tractor until 3 in the morning, sleeping for 3 hours before dragging himself back out into the cold. Slowly, agonizingly, the crescent wall began to take shape. It was a jagged, primitive spine of stone rising from the prairie, curving precisely to catch and diffuse the devil's breath. By late April, Thomas had managed to build roughly half a mile of the wall. The southern half of his property was completely exposed, but the northern half was now shielded behind 6 feet of interlocking granite. With time running out, Thomas finally fired up the planters. He sowed his corn, putting every last penny of their remaining credit into the highest quality seed he could find. When he finished, he had exactly $18 left in his checking account. For the first 2 weeks of May, the weather was eerily calm. Green shoots began to break through the dark soil. For a brief, shining moment, the valley looked peaceful. Then came the fury of late spring. The weather sirens in Oakhaven wailed to life at 2 in the afternoon on a Tuesday. The sky over the Canadian border turned a bruised, sickening purple. It wasn't a tornado, but a straight-line windstorm, a derecho. Meteorologists were recording sustained winds of 70 miles per hour, with gusts topping 90. It was a localized hurricane sweeping across the plains. Harlan Miller, watching his sophisticated weather radar, cursed and locked himself in his storm cellar. There was nothing anyone could do. Thomas didn't go to the cellar. He stood on the back porch of the farmhouse, the wind tearing at his clothes, his eyes locked on the western ridge. The roar was deafening a sound, like a freight train screaming through the valley. The storm slammed into Oakhaven with apocalyptic force. Across the highway, Thomas could see the wind ripping through Harlan Miller's pristine, unprotected fields. Thousands of acres of young, fragile corn were instantly flattened, snapped at the stems, the precious topsoil hurled into the air in massive brown clouds. Then the gale hit Thomas's property. On the southern half of his land, where the wall was unfinished, the devastation was total. The crop was annihilated. In seconds, the dirt scoured down to the hardpan. But as the wind met the northern half of the ridge, something miraculous happened. The gale slammed into the half-mile crescent of stone. The massive boulders shuddered, but the interlocking geometry held. The wind howled furiously, attempting to batter its way through, but the thousands of tiny gaps fractured the sheer force of the blow. The main thrust of the 90-mile-per-hour wind was forced violently upward, launching off the top of the wall and soaring high over the fields. Behind the wall, the air pressure shifted. Thomas could see the dust swirling, but the young corn stalks behind the barrier were merely swaying in a brisk breeze. They weren't snapping. They weren't being uprooted. The wall was working. The storm raged for 4 hours before finally breaking. When Thomas walked out into the aftermath, the silence was heavy. He waded through the southern half of his farm. It was a total loss. Half of his potential yield was gone, obliterated by the wind. But as he crossed the invisible line into the northern acreage, he fell to his knees in the damp earth. The corn stalk stood perfectly upright. The soil was untouched. And just as he had noticed weeks ago, the massive stones of the wall having absorbed the brief afternoon sun before the storm were radiating a gentle warmth that kept the chilling rain from freezing the roots. He had won the battle, but the war was far from over. The next morning, Richard Cole's silver sedan pulled up the muddy driveway. The banker stepped out, looking at the destroyed southern fields with cold, calculating eyes. "I saw the damage reports for the county," Cole said, not even bothering to say hello. "Harlan Miller lost 30% of his crop, and he has the reserves to survive it. Looking at your southern acreage, you've lost half your yield. Even if your northern field produces perfectly, you mathematically cannot hit the 150 bushels an acre we agreed upon for the whole property." Thomas stood up, his battered hands clenching into fists. "The northern field survived because of the wall. I can double the yield there." Cole let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Double the yield on this soil, Thomas. You're delusional. I'm sorry. I'll give you until the end of the harvest to pack up the house. First Dakota is calling in the loan." Richard Cole's silver sedan disappeared down the gravel road, leaving a cloud of fine, choking dust in its wake. Thomas Garrick remained standing in the mud, his ruined hands resting on his hips. The bank had practically signed his death warrant, mathematically condemning the farm, before the summer had even truly begun. According to the spreadsheets and risk assessment algorithms sitting on Cole's polished oak desk in town, Thomas was a ghost. He was a dead man walking through a dead man's fields. Sarah walked out of the farmhouse, her boots sinking softly into the damp earth. She wrapped a thick wool blanket around her husband's shoulders, silently leaning her head against his back. Neither of them spoke. The devastation on the southern half of the property was an open wound. Acres of snapped corn stalks lay decaying in the dirt, their fragile root systems brutally ripped from the topsoil by the derecho's merciless shear. "He's wrong," Thomas finally whispered, his voice trembling with a terrifying absolute certainty. "Cole is wrong. The math is wrong." Sarah sighed, her breath pluming in the crisp morning air. "Thomas, we lost half the acreage. Even if the northern field has a perfect season, 50% of a perfect crop won't cover the debt." "Then it won't just be perfect," Thomas replied, turning to face his wife, his eyes ablaze with a frantic, brilliant intensity. "It's going to be something this valley has never seen before." The obsession took hold of Thomas with a ferocity that frightened even the most hardened locals of Oakhaven. With the southern field completely decimated, he redirected every ounce of his remaining energy, fuel, and time into the surviving northern acreage protected by the half-mile crescent of dry stone wall. He spent hours on his hands and knees, digging into the earth behind the barrier, obsessively studying the soil mechanics. What he discovered was nothing short of agricultural alchemy. For decades, agronomy textbooks had dictated that the prairie soil in North Dakota was acidic, requiring thousands of dollars in chemical lime treatments to balance the pH for optimal corn growth. But the glacial till that Thomas had dragged out of the earth and stacked into his wall was predominantly composed of natural limestone and granite. As the frequent spring rains lashed against the towering stone structure, the water slowly dissolved, microscopic traces of calcium carbonate from the limestone weeping gently down into the soil on the leeward side of the wall. Thomas tested the dirt. The pH directly behind the wall was a perfect 6.8. The stones were passively sweetening the earth. But that wasn't the only miracle the wall was performing. The microclimate effect Thomas had noticed in April was magnifying as the season progressed. During the blistering heat of the day, the massive granite boulders absorbed the solar radiation. When the sun dipped below the horizon and the valley's temperature plummeted, the wall acted as a colossal thermal battery, radiating its stored heat backward over the crop canopy. This delicate blanket of warmth kept the soil biology aggressively active throughout the night, pushing the corn to grow at an accelerated, almost unnatural pace. Desperate for nutrients to feed this rapid growth, but completely out of money for commercial fertilizers, Thomas committed his next act of perceived madness. He fired up his rusted tractor, hooked up the disc harrow, and drove into the ruined southern field. He aggressively churned the dead, snapped corn stalks back into the topsoil, then loaded the remaining organic debris into a manure spreader. He transported tons of this raw, shredded plant matter to the northern field, laying it down between the surviving rows as a thick, protective mulch. Harlan Miller watched this from his air-conditioned pickup truck, shaking his head in sheer disbelief. "The boy is fertilizing his living crop with the corpses of his dead one," Harlan muttered to his foreman. "He's gone completely native. It's pathetic." But the real test arrived in late July. The rain simply stopped. The vibrant, humid spring gave way to a punishing, unrelenting summer drought. The skies over Oakhaven turned a pale, dusty blue, devoid of a single cloud for 5 agonizing weeks. The thermometer consistently hovered above 95 degrees. The devil's breath returned, no longer carrying cold Canadian air, but acting as a massive, invisible blowtorch that rapidly evaporated whatever meager moisture remained in the valley's soil. Across the county, panic set in. Harlan Miller's sophisticated irrigation pivots ran 24 hours a day, draining his underground aquifers at an alarming rate, yet his expansive cornfields were still beginning to curl and turn a sickly greyish yellow. The relentless hot winds were stressing the plants to the breaking point. On the Garrick farm, Thomas had no irrigation system. He had no deep water wells. He had only the wall, and the wall proved to be a fortress. Every morning, just before dawn, the temperature drop would normally cause a light dew to form. In the open plains, the early morning sun and the relentless wind would immediately vaporize this dew before it could reach the soil. But Thomas's wall, standing 6 feet tall on the western ridge, cast a long protective shadow over the northern field during the most critical early hours of the day. The wall trapped the morning dew. The thick mulch of dead stalks prevented the moisture from evaporating, and most importantly, the jagged, permeable stone structure completely shattered the hot, desiccating winds that were currently burning Harlan Miller's empire to a crisp, while the rest of Oakhaven Valley slowly turned brown and withered under the punishing sun. The northern half of the Garrick farm remained an impossibly lush, dark green oasis. The corn stalks behind the stone barrier didn't just survive the drought, they thrived. Without having to expend precious biological energy fighting the constant wind shear or struggling against heat stress, the plants redirected every ounce of their cellular power into reproduction. The stalks grew to an astonishing 9 feet tall. The stalks were thick, resembling the trunks of small saplings rather than fragile grass. In mid-August, Harlan Miller finally couldn't contain his curiosity. He parked his truck at the property line and walked over to the stone wall, his expensive leather boots crunching against the dry earth. He peeked through one of the structural gaps in the limestone. What he saw made the blood drain from his face. He wasn't looking at a struggling farmer's final pathetic attempt at a harvest. He was looking at a jungle. The ears of corn were massive, bursting out of their husks, thick with perfectly aligned golden kernels. It was the heaviest, most densely packed crop Harlan had ever seen in his 50 years of farming. Thomas stepped out from behind a row of stalks, a smudge of grease on his cheek, holding a massive ear of corn in his calloused hand. He looked at Harlan, his expression calm, devoid of arrogance or malice. "Afternoon, Harlan," Thomas said quietly. Harlan opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He looked at the wall, then at the corn, and finally at Thomas's ruined, permanently scarred hands. For the first time in his life, the Titan of Oakhaven Valley had absolutely nothing to say. November arrived with a bitter, biting chill, signaling the end of the agricultural year and the moment of absolute reckoning. The skies were heavily overcast, a thick blanket of grey that mirrored the oppressive mood hanging over the Garrick farmhouse. Today was harvest day. It was also foreclosure day. Richard Cole had not forgotten the timeline. At precisely 8 in the morning, the silver sedan crunched down the frozen gravel driveway, accompanied by a white Ford Explorer, bearing the insignia of the County Sheriff Department. Cole stepped out, clutching his slim leather briefcase containing the final legal documents with him. He was here to witness the failure he had so confidently predicted in May. Thomas and Sarah were already outside. Sarah stood near the barn, her hands tightly clasped together, her breath hitching with nervous anticipation. Thomas was sitting high in the cab of his rented aging John Deere combine. He had spent the last 2 days desperately patching the machine together with duct tape baling wire and sheer willpower, praying the engine would hold out just long enough to cut the northern field. Thomas turned the ignition key. The diesel engine roared to life, coughing black smoke upwards immediately. He engaged the threshing cylinder, the massive steel teeth spinning with a violent, rhythmic hum. Cole leaned against the hood of his sedan, checking his gold wristwatch. He muttered to the sheriff that Thomas needed 150 bushels an acre across the whole farm. With the southern field gone, he mathematically needed 300 bushels an acre up north to average out. The state record was barely 240. They would be locking the gates by noon. Thomas dropped the gathering head of the combine and pushed the hydrostatic lever forward, moving toward the towering stalks. The massive machine crawled toward the towering 9-foot-tall wall of green and gold, standing defiantly behind the stone barrier. As the combine bit into the first row, the sound shifted from a mechanical hum to a deep, guttural roar under the immense volume of the crop. The stalk choppers obliterated the thick bases, and the massive ears of corn were violently fed into the threshing drum. Inside the cab, Thomas kept his eyes glued to the digital yield monitor mounted on the right-hand console. The numbers flickered, calculating the flow of grain passing the optical sensors inside. 180 bushels. Thomas held his breath as the machine pushed forward. 210 bushels. The machine shuddered slightly as it hit a particularly dense patch of the field. The grain tank directly behind his head began to fill at an alarming, unprecedented rate. A river of golden corn poured from the clean grain auger. 260 bushels. Down on the ground, Cole watched the combine make its first pass. He noticed the speed at which Thomas had to slow down to prevent the machine from choking on the sheer volume of harvested grain. He noticed the unloading auger swinging out far earlier than it should have for a standard yield. Thomas reached the end of the first row and turned the machine around. He glanced at the monitor. It had stabilized 312 bushels per acre. It was an impossible number. It defied the genetics of the seed, the chemistry of the soil, and the brutal history of the valley. But the monitor was not lying. The grain tank was already nearing capacity. By 10 in the morning, Thomas had to call the local grain elevator for a semi-truck fleet. His own modest grain carts were overflowing. The golden mountain of corn kept coming, a relentless, roaring waterfall of pure agricultural triumph. The microclimate created by the stone wall had preserved the morning dew, buffered the horrific derecho, sweetened the soil, and retained the thermal heat. It created an absolutely perfect utopian growing environment right in the middle of a barren wasteland. The plants, completely relieved of their environmental stress, had pushed their biological limits to the absolute maximum. When the final stalk was cut at 3 in the afternoon, the silence that fell over the farm was totally deafening. Thomas climbed down the ladder of the combine, his legs trembling from exhaustion and adrenaline. He walked over to where Richard Cole and the sheriff were still standing. The bank officer was ashen, staring blankly at the line of heavy semi-trucks, fully loaded with grain, idling on the highway. Thomas did not say a single word. He reached into the front pocket of his heavy canvas jacket, pulled out the printed ticket from the combine yield monitor, and handed it directly to Cole. The eyes of the banker darted rapidly across the numbers printed on the small white paper. The northern field had produced an average yield of 318 bushels per acre. Factoring in the complete loss of the southern field, the total farm average stood at 159 bushels per acre. 9 bushels over the uncompromising, supposedly impossible quota. Cole slowly lowered the slip of paper. The smugness was entirely gone, replaced by the profound, hollow realization that he had just been outsmarted by a man with bleeding hands and a pile of rocks. He closed his leather briefcase with a quiet snap, nodded tightly, and got back into his silver sedan. Without uttering a single syllable, he retreated down the gravel road, disappearing for good. Sarah sprinted across the frozen dirt, throwing her arms around his neck. Tears streamed down her face as they held each other tightly. They had finally conquered the earth. A few moments later, Harlan Miller pulled up to the driveway. The old Titan stepped out, walked over to the dry stone wall, and respectfully ran his weathered hand along the massive blocks. He removed his cap, turning toward Thomas. He asked quietly how much it would cost to learn to build one himself that next spring. If Thomas's incredible journey of turning a curse into a triumph inspired you, hit that like button and share this video with someone who needs a reminder to never give up. Sometimes the obstacles in our path are actually the stepping stones to our greatest success. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss another unbelievable real-life story. Leave a comment below. What rocks are you facing in your own life today?